I think this is probably lesson around 24 or so. And I titled tonight, Dejected. Elijah's dejected. And I want us to look at the effects that giving into fear had upon the prophet Elijah. The message which had come from Jezebel, that on the morrow she was going to take revenge on him for the slaying of her prophets, caused Elijah to be panic-stricken. We talked about that last week. It's amazing. Everything he had seen, and yet he's panic-stricken now. But it's not any different than Israel, was it? Israel watched God perform those mighty deeds in Egypt, those 10 plagues, and then they get up against the Red Sea, and oh, woe is us, and then they watch God destroy the Egyptian army, and then they're still, it's never enough. So it's not like he's a unique figure here. But at the very moment that God saw fit to leave Elijah to himself, we learn that even the strongest men are weaker than water when the Almighty withdraws his support. Now, God would not have withdrawn his support had Elijah gone to him in prayer, but Elijah takes it upon himself. The strongest and most powerful man, I guess, who ever walked on this earth, I'm not talking about Jesus Christ, but man, was Samson. But he was weak and powerless as any other man as soon as the Spirit of the Lord departed from him. We need the Lord. It doesn't matter how strong your growth is in grace, how well you're experienced in your spiritual life. It doesn't matter what a prominent position you may occupy in the Lord's service. When God withdraws his sustaining hand, the madness which is in our heart by nature asserts itself on us. It gains the upper hand on us, and it leads us to a course of foolishness. And that's exactly the position we find Elijah right now. Rather than taking the angry queen's threat to the Lord, requesting him to aid him, asking him what he wanted him to do, he went for his life, according to 1 Kings 19:3. He took off. He took matters into his own hands. You want to get in trouble? You take matters into your own hands. I attempted to explain that why the Lord suffered his servant to experience this lapse at this particular time. But that was last week, and there's something else I didn't mention now. I believe that Elijah's flight was also a punishment on the northern kingdom because of their insincerity and their inconsistency and their reformation. They were not what they should be yet. You would have thought that after that public manifestation of the glory of God, the clear victory that Elijah had over the prophets of Baal, the confusion of Baal's prophets, and then the satisfaction of the people after they had seen both fire and water come from heaven at the prayer of Elijah. And these things happened in mercy to them. And the one is a sign of acceptance of their offering. The other is a refreshment reminding them of their inheritance. They should now, above everything else, return to the worship of God. They should have stood behind Elijah. You would think they would have taken Elijah as their guide. Actually, when you look at the situation, you would have said, we want Elijah to be our prime minister. We want him to lead us. We want to accept the directions of the Lord throughout this entire northern kingdom. But it was quite the opposite. Elijah, the man that God had honored, was neglected by the northern kingdom. There's no respect paid to him, nor is there any use made of him. But on the contrary, in the land of Israel, to which he had been a mighty witness, he had been a great witness to them, he finds it impossible to aid them any longer. Elijah's departure from Israel, and he never returned, by the way, was a judgment upon them. In the scriptures, God's children are exhorted again and again not to fear. Neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. That's Isaiah 8:12. But we all tend to be weak and trembling, and fear at times will overtake us. But the very next verse, Isaiah 8:13, says, sanctify the Lord of hosts, and let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. Fear not, God's on your side. We forget that so often. This fear is respect, honor, and reverence of the Lord in our hearts, and that delivers us from the fear of men. Be not afraid of their faces, said God to another of his servants, a fellow named Jeremiah, adding, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord. Jeremiah 8:1. What do you have to fear if the Lord's with you? In our consciousness of his presence, which faith must take to heart, then fear will be still. Once we understand that, once we hold on to it. Over in Matthew 8:26, Jesus admonished his disciples for their fear. Why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith? There it is. He asks the question and answers it, doesn't he? Why are you fearful? Little faith. Be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. 1 Peter 3:14 is the word which we are required to take to heart. In connection with Elijah's flight from Jezebel, we're told first that he came to Beersheba, which belonged to Judah. That's 1 Kings 19:3. He came to Beersheba. When you first glance at that, you say, okay, Elijah's back home now. He's back in Judea. He's down at Beersheba. He's found a safe refuge there in Judah. He's secure. Oh, he's outside that territory that's governed by Ahab and Jezebel. But what we actually have here is like the old adage, Elijah has jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. You say, what are you talking about, Pastor? He's gone. He's out of the northern kingdom. Well, the southern kingdom of Judah at that time was ruled by a fellow named Jehoshaphat. And according to 2 Kings 18:8, he had a son, and that son married the daughter of Ahab. What you have here then is a connection. That marriage closely allied those two houses, Ahab and Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, as a matter of fact, declared in 1 Kings 22:4, talking about that union, I am as thou art, my people as thy people, my horses as thy horses. That's a close relationship. As a matter of fact, it is that Jehoshaphat would have had no qualms whatsoever in delivering Elijah up to Ahab had the command come from Ahab and Jezebel. He really wasn't safe, was he? He is because he's in God's hands, but physically he's not. So obviously, we understand that Elijah could not linger in Beersheba. He would have to continue his flight. He had to continue going. Beersheba is in the extreme south of Judah, being situated in the inheritance of Simeon. And it's estimated at this point that Elijah and his servant covered about 80 miles from Jezreel. Doesn't sound like much to us today. We go out, we get in the car, we start it up, and drive 80 miles. Within 2 hours, you're there. When you're on foot, it's a little different. So we see here Elijah's thoughtfulness and compassion for his lone servant. The next thing we see is that Elijah left his servant there. Elijah was anxious to spare his servant the hardships of that dreary wilderness of Arabia where he'd now planned to enter. You've been a faithful servant to me, but you stay here. They're not looking for you. There's no harm going to come to you. You stay here. I'm going on. You know, this consideration that Elijah gave his servant is an example for all masters to follow. They should not require their dependents to encounter unreasonable perils or perform services above their strength. Moreover, at this point, Elijah wanted to be alone. He wished to be alone. He wanted to be alone with his trouble and not give vent to his feelings of despair in front of anyone else. You know, that's also something that we need to copy. It's important. When fear and unbelief fill a believer's heart, and when he's at the point of giving expression to his dejection, the Christian should retire from the presence of others so that he will not infect others with the spiritual illness that he has and the moodiness. You want to drag somebody down? You just get around them and start, oh, this is so low, I can't, oh, whoa. And pretty soon everybody starts to feel the same way. Elijah didn't want that to happen. The Christian should unburden his heart to the Lord and spare his brethren those feelings. 1 Kings 19:4 says, but he himself, after he left his servant, went a day's journey into the wilderness. Here's another effect of fear and unbelief. It produces alarm and anxiety, so the spirit of restlessness seizes the soul. He went another day's journey. He just keeps going. You know, if you think about it, it can't be any other way, can it? Rest of soul is found nowhere but in the Lord, by communicating with him and confiding in him. Isaiah 57:20 says, the wicked are like a troubled sea when it cannot rest. And necessarily so, for they are utter strangers to the God that gives rest. The way of peace they have not known. Romans 3:17. When a Christian, and it doesn't make any difference, any Christian, when they fall out of fellowship with God, when he takes matters into his own hands, when faith and hope are no longer exercised, his case is no better than the unregenerate person outside the doors. He has cut himself off from his comforts, and he is thoroughly miserable. When a believer is out of fellowship with the Lord, he's out of contentment and delight in the Lord. He's no longer in a position to be with him. Instead, his mind is in turmoil. He is thoroughly demoralized, and then mainly seeks to find relief in the ceaseless round of diversions and the activities of the flesh. He gets involved in the world, anything to try to take his mind off of his problems. And all he has to do is go to the Lord. He must be on the move all the time because he's completely disturbed, and he wearies himself in vain exercises till his natural strength just gives out. I want you, in your mind's eye, I want you now to try to follow Elijah's flight. Hour after hour, he now heads off, continuing south. That burning sun, his feet are probably blistered from that scorching sand, and he's alone out in a dreary desert. At least he's alone from any comrades. At last, we see that fatigue and anguish overtake him, and his strength is starting to dry up. And 1 Kings 19:4 says, he came and sat under a juniper tree and requested for himself that he might die. Interesting, isn't it? He fled from Jezebel at the thought of death. And now he sits under that tree and he requested of himself that he might die. Well, the first thing I want you to note in this connection is that disheartened and despondent as he was, Elijah made no attempt to take his own life. You notice that? He did not attempt suicide. Though now for a season God had withheld his comforting presence and measured his restraining grace, yet he did not and never does wholly deliver one of his own into the power of the devil. That's not going to happen. Wicked men do not live out half their days, according to Psalm 55:23. For either disease sends them to an untimely grave or Satan moves them to commit suicide. That's a sign that you've abandoned God. Elijah then was not, we see, he's not utterly deserted by God. He's in a position, I wish I could die. But he didn't take it upon himself to do it, which means God has not given him completely over to anything like that. And he requested for himself that he might die. The second thing we note was the inconsistency of his conduct. As I mentioned a moment ago, he hurriedly left out of fear for his life when Jezebel threatened him. He went for his life, and now he longs that his life might be taken from him. That's the effect of unbelief and fear on the heart of a person. Not only do we act foolishly and wrongly, not only does the spirit of unrest and discontent take possession of us, but we're thrown completely off balance. The soul loses its poise, and the consistency of conduct is at an end. The explanation is simple. Truth is uniform and harmonious, whereas error exists in many forms. But the truth to effectually control us, faith must be in consistent and continual exercise. When faith ceases to act, we at once become erratic and we become undependable, and as men speak, we're just nothing but a bundle of contradictions. Consistency of character and conduct is dependent upon our steady walk with God. Probably there are a few of God's servants, but who at some time or other are eager to cast off their hardness and cease from their labors of conflict, particularly when their labors seem to be in vain and they're disposed to look upon themselves as a burden. I'm not getting anything accomplished. I just give up. Moses, for example, exclaimed, I'm not able to bear all this people alone because it is too heavy for me. And he at once added, and if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of thy hand. Numbers 11, 14, and 15. Jonah prayed, therefore now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. God still used those men, didn't he? God did not give them over. He didn't give them over to suicide. He didn't give them over to the devil. He still used them. You know, the longing to be removed from this world of trouble is not just peculiar to the ministers of God or the missionaries or those type people. Many of just normal Christians, believers, his people, also at times moved to say like David did in Psalm 55:6, oh, that I had wings like a dove, that I would fly away and be at rest. You know, short as our sojourn here on this earth seems to be, it seems long, doesn't it? Even short. It's easier for us to notice now as we get older how short that sojourn really is. When you're at the young age, it looks like it's forever. Now it passes quickly. It's too long for some of us, it seems like. And though we cannot vindicate Elijah's irritability and his moodiness, I can sympathize with him under that juniper tree. For I've often been there myself. And I'm sure you have too. You've sat under that tree and I've had enough. It should have been pointed out that there's a radical difference between desiring to be delivered out of this world of disappointment and pain and sorrow, and a longing to be delivered from this body of death in order to be present with the Lord. The latter part of that, to be present with, was the case with the Apostle Paul when he said in Philippians 1:23, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. A desire to be freed from the dismal poverty or the bed of languishing, it's natural. But yearning to be delivered from the world of iniquity and the body of death so that we might enjoy that unclouded communion with the Lord, that's truly spiritual. The desire to be with Him. One of the greatest surprises of our own Christian life has been to find out how very few people give evidence of truly desiring the enjoyment of an unclouded communion with the Lord Jesus Christ, and see that as truly spiritual. A majority of professing Christians appear to be so married to this world, to this scene, so in love with this life, and so fearful of the prospect of death that they cling to this life just as tenaciously as an unbeliever. Surely, in that case, heaven can't be very real to them. True, we ought to submissively wait for God's time, and you're going to, regardless. Yet that should not preclude or override a desire to depart and be with Christ. We wait on Him patiently, but the desire should be there. It's the same as waiting on the rapture. It may not happen in our lifetime, but it doesn't keep us from expecting it at any moment. But let's not lose sight of the fact that in his dejection, Elijah turned to God and said, "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." 1 Kings 19. Oh, see now, he's coming, "O Lord." It's the first time we see him actually beginning to ask the Lord, talk to the Lord again. No matter how cast down we are, how severe our grief may be, it's always a privilege for the believer to be able to unburden his heart to the Lord, who is one who sticketh closer than a brother. And we can pour out our complaints, our worries, our pains to a sympathetic ear. True, God is not going to wink at what's wrong. Not going to do it. Nevertheless, He is touched with the feelings of our infirmities. It's also true that He will not always grant our requests, because so often we ask amiss, as James 4:3 tells us. But if He withholds something that we desire, you can be sure of one thing: He has something better for us. That's the case of Elijah. The Lord did not take his life from him at that point. Matter of fact, He didn't take his life later. He was taken to heaven without ever seeing death. Here's under the tree, "Oh, take my life. I'm ready to die." He never tasted death. It's amazing, isn't it? He's one of only 2 people who entered heaven without going through the portals of death. The other one being Enoch. That's one. That was your quiz for the night. He was and was not. Nevertheless, God's chariot for Elijah's ride to heaven came at God's appointed time, not Elijah's. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I'm not better than my fathers." He was tired. Elijah was tired. He was tired of the ceaseless opposition he had encountered. He was weary of the strife. He was disheartened in his labors. He felt that everything he had done was to no avail. "Oh, I've striven hard, but it's been in vain. I've toiled all night and I caught nothing." Remember the disciples? We haven't caught anything. That's the language of disappointment and fear. It is enough. I'm unwilling to fight any longer. I've done and I've suffered sufficient. Let me go. We're not sure what it is signified by when he says, I'm not better than my fathers. He may have been pleading his weakness and inability. I'm not stronger than they were. I'm no better able to cope with the difficulties than they were. Perhaps he alluded to the fact that he didn't feel he had much fruit in his ministry. Oh, nothing comes of my labors. I'm no more successful than they were. It may be that he was suggesting his disappointment because God had not fulfilled his expectations. He was thoroughly despondent, and he was anxious to quit the arena. He had just felt like he felt like he hadn't accomplished anything. We see here once more the consequences which follow giving way to fear and unbelief. Poor Elijah was now in the quicksand of despondency, an experience which few, if any, of the Lord's people escape not having one time or another. We get in that quicksand and it takes the Lord to pull us out. Elijah had forsaken his place which the Lord had brought him, and now he was tasting the bitter effects of his self-will. All pleasure was gone out of his life. The joy of the Lord was no longer his strength. Oh, what a rod we do make for our backs when we deliberately depart the path of duty. By leaving the paths of righteousness, we cut ourselves off from the springs of spiritual refreshment, and we enter the wilderness just as he did. The wilderness is now our dwelling place. And we sit down in utter dejection, alone in our ministry, and there's none to comfort us while we are in that particular state. Death is desired. Put it into the misery. I've had enough. If we try to pray, it's the murmurings of our heart which finds expression. My will and thine be done according. That has to be the substance. And what was the Lord's response when he said, not mine, but thine will be done? Did he turn with disgust from the sight and leave his erring servant to reap what they had sown and suffer full and final deserts of his unbelief? Did God do that? No. Shall the good shepherd refuse to take care of one of his sheep that's gone astray? Leave him helplessly laying by the wayside? No. Will the great physician refuse assistance to one of his patients just when he needs him most? Blessed be the name. The Lord is long suffering toward us, we're not willing that any should perish. 2 Peter 3:9. And Psalm 103:13 says, like a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him, have reverence toward him. And that's the way it was here. The Lord evidenced his pity for his dejected servant in a most gracious manner. The next thing we read is Elijah slept under the juniper tree. 1 Kings 19:5. When you read that, you're apt to just read over it and say, well, he was so exhausted, he fell asleep. But we need to look at something. When you say that he just exhausted and fell asleep, that's dishonoring God. When there are few left who can realize that, according to Psalm 127:2, he giveth his beloved sleep. It's something better than, well, let nature take its course. It's the Lord refreshing his weary prophet. This is more or less recognized and owned by believers in the matter of food and clothing, in health and strength, but it's ignored when it comes to the point that we're talking about here, sleep. Sleep is an imperative for physical well-being, just as food and drink. And one is just as much a gift of the Father as the other. Did you ever realize that? We cannot put ourselves to sleep by any effort of our own will. Think about it. You can't do it. And anybody that suffers from insomnia will tell you that. Nor does exercise or manual labor in itself ensure sleep. Have you ever laid down exhausted and found out that you were too tired to sleep? Sleep is a divine gift. But the nightly recurrence of it blinds us to that fact. We take it for granted, like we take having food in the refrigerator and the cabinet's full and everything else. Many years ago, there was a man who suffered from pneumonia, and he was not able to sleep whatever, day or night, for over a week, and there was nothing the doctors could do because his cough just neutralized any efforts to sleep. So when it pleased him, God withholds sleep, and then we have to say with the psalmist, "Thou holdest my eyes waking." Psalm 77:4. But that's the exception rather than the rule. And we should be deeply thankful for that. Day by day the Lord feeds us. Night by night he giveth us beloved sleep. And that's the way this little detail is in Elijah's life. Sleeping under that juniper tree. We're likely to pass over it lightly when you read, "Oh, he fell asleep." Isn't that wonderful? People do it in church service every Sunday. We just take over it. But it's important. We need to see God's gracious hand ministering just as tenderly as he can to one of his dear servants under that tree. Yes, the Lord pitied them that fear him. And why? For he knoweth our frame, and he remembereth that we are dust. Psalm 103:14. We're dust. If you get a handful of dust, you can blow it away. God is mindful of our frailty, and he tempers his winds accordingly. God, with the breath of his nostril, could blow us away. He's aware that our energies are spent. He renews our strength graciously. It was not God's desire that his servant should die of exhaustion in the wilderness after that long, long flight from Jezreel. So he mercifully refreshed his body with sleep. We see how compassionate God is with us. How little are we affected by God's goodness and grace upon us, though? We just take so much for granted. The unfailing reoccurrence of his mercies, both temporal and spiritual, incline us. It's just a matter of course. Sometimes we think we just deserve it. So dull of understanding are we, so cold are our hearts Godward. It is to be feared that most of the time we fail to realize whose loving hand is actually ministering to us. Isn't that the very reason that we don't really value our health until we don't have it? Till we have to spend the night in a bed of pain? Do we perceive the worth of regular sleep? Isn't that true? And such vile creatures as we are, when illness and insomnia come upon us, instead of improving the same by repenting of our former ingratitude and humbly confessing the same to God, we murmur and we complain at the hardness of our present lot and wonder, what have we done to deserve such a treatment? Well, let those of us who are still blessed with good health and regular sleep not to forget to daily thank the Lord for that privilege and earnestly seek the grace that we need and seek to bring glory to God. And I will stop there.